Picture yourself walking through a crowded street. The atmosphere is festive and the air smells sweet, a mix of bread, oranges, and incense. Everyone is dressed in bright colors, and you're surrounded by smiling faces painted like cartoonish skulls. The energy is vibrant and uplifting, but equally serene and respectful. This is Día de los Muertos. The Day of the Dead is perhaps the most well-known celebration across Latin America. It's a cultural celebration of life for the living and a traditional way of honoring the memory of those who have passed across generations. Today, we're diving into Día de los Muertos. We'll explore its cultural origins and tell you where and how you can experience it for yourself. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Traveling with AAA. I am so excited about today's episode because we are talking about Day of the Dead, where to celebrate it, what it means. And we have two experts here who are going to give us all the details. So first, I want to introduce you to Dr. Mathew Sandoval. He's an Arizona State University professor who has researched Day of the Dead and its impact on art, pop culture, film, and tourism. He's focused on how the holiday is celebrated in Mexico, as well as examined how it's developed from ancient ritual to mass media spectacle. We also have Lauren Cocking, a Yorkshire, England-born, Mexico City-based freelance travel writer who has written extensively about traveling in Mexico and Day of the Dead for publications like The Independent, Fodor's, and Culture Trip. She's visited several of the destinations we're going to talk about today. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. So let's start with you, Dr. Sandoval. What is the cultural and historic background of Day of the Dead? Where do we start?
I usually start when I speak with my students or I give public talks on Día de Muertos. I usually begin by talking about it as what anthropologists call a syncretic holiday, meaning it's a mixture. It's a mixture of a lot of different cultural traditions. One, of course, being indigenous Mesoamerican tradition, native peoples from what we now identify as Mexico, as well as a mixture of Spanish Catholicism. But Spanish Catholicism is also a hybrid mixture in and of itself. So there are elements of Dia de Muertos that are, I would say, indigenous, European, and North African as well, because, of course, Spain in the 1500s, 1600s was a very eclectic cultural place.
Lauren, tell us, when does it take place? What happens on this day?
Most of the celebrations would happen from the night of the November 1st to the morning, early hours of November 2nd. But preparations will begin way in advance, especially for things like altars and parades. And the parade sometimes doesn't coincide with the actual dates of the holidays. If you go into a parade, you can expect to see sort of monumental floats, altars, decorations, people dancing, big crowds. I'm speaking specifically about Mexico City here, which is where I'm based. And then if you're going to more of the evening celebrations, which are the graveside vigils, that takes place obviously after dark. There'll be lots of candles, flowers, photos, fruits, foods, and sometimes dance performances and other cultural celebrations and events. But yeah, that is typically what happens for Day of the Dead.
Historically, it is celebrated on November 1st and 2nd in order to correspond to the Catholic holidays of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. If you go most places in Mexico, you're going to find fiestas lasting for a long time, well before and well after that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you'll see things getting ready, set up here weeks and weeks in advance. Things like altars in the Zocalo, in the center of the city, and also in UNAM on the campus. They have sawdust decorations on the floor and designs, and those will last for a good few days before and after the celebration. So you have time to see everything.
This is not Mexican Halloween. And I think some people reduce it to thinking they're kind of equal. That's U.S. Halloween and Dia de Muertos is that. But it's not, right?
If you were to go to Mexico, and especially Mexico City, you will find that so much of Dia de los Muertos celebrations are filled with Halloween that it's becoming very difficult for us to say anymore that Day of the Dead is not Mexican Halloween, because Halloween is becoming a very significant part of the celebrations. I would say probably the biggest main distinction, though, of course, is that Dia de Muertos is reserved for honoring the dead, and honoring ancestors specifically. So I think that's what makes Day of the Dead really significant, is that it's not just a matter of honoring those who you've recently lost. It's almost always about honoring your ancestors specifically. And that holds true whether the celebrations are in Mexico or whether they're in the United States or across Latin America. So the altars that you would create, the ofrendas that you create for the dead, are not just those who've recently passed. It's for those who are your great, 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 great abuelos, abuelas, your grandparents, who you may have never met, but you still find a way to honor them. So the holiday is always about deep ancestral appreciation, which sets it apart from Halloween, because Halloween, of course, doesn't honor any of those things, or at least modern Halloween.
Let's talk about what traditional Day of the Dead looks like. If you show up on the scene, what are you going to see? What are you going to smell? What are you going to hear?
The typical image that possibly comes to mind when you imagine Day of the Dead, of the graveside vigils in the cemeteries at night, you're going to see a lot of flowers. Orange is the color of Day of the Dead, for me at least. With the cempasúchiles, the Mexican marigold flowers, you'll see them everywhere. They're very popular around this time of year. In terms of scents, it's going to be incense, it's going to be the flowers themselves. Orange is a scent as well that's very strong here during those days. And as well, food, like typical antojitos, anything you'll find on a comal, tacos, tlacoyos. It depends where you are, of course, but that kind of vibe is, for me, the sort of sensorial side of Day of the Dead. And then, of course, you're going to have a lot of candles, sugar skulls, generally skeleton imagery, calacas, calaveritas, and often people with face paint. Yeah, sure. Traditional clothes, traditional dress, sometimes alebrijes, sometimes Day of the Dead bread, which is delicious, by the way. Yeah, you'll find that a lot on altares, and other foods, fruits, bananas, weirdly, are often on there. Yeah. And the papel picado, of course, which is like the paper bunting. You'll see that hung up and decorated in altares and ofrendas and in businesses, streets, small pueblitos. It's very colorful.
It's very colorful, and I would say that the colors, the vibrancy of the fiesta is intentional, right? It's not just about honoring the dead. It's also about acknowledging that we too will die someday, but we are not dead yet, and therefore we need to party, we need to live life to the absolute fullest. And so that's why you see such vibrancy on Día de Muertos. It's because it's also a reminder that, hey, we aren't dead, we're here, let's party, let's eat, let's drink. One of the things that you'll see at Día de Muertos, whether it's a parade or whether it's a celebration in a plaza or in a graveside, is just communities coming together or people coming together. And to me, that's what really makes Day of the Dead quite special, is that it's not just about honoring your own dead and your own ancestors. It's always a collective celebration. It's a public celebration in a very real way, so that it's people honoring their dead collectively, which is why it's usually a community celebration. Even if you don't necessarily know the people who are gathered at the grave next to you, you will get to know them over the course of that day, spending time in the cemetery together. It's kind of integral to the holiday.
The sugar skulls and the candles and the animal figures, all that, the face painting, what does that all mean? Like, what does that symbolize? And is it different for different families? How does it work?
It's been around in Mexico. This idea of creating little skulls out of sugar has been around for several hundred years. So it's North African origin, which comes to Mexico by virtue of colonization from the Spaniards. So it's got a very long and crazy history to it, but it's usually a very festive thing. So the other thing is that the sugar skulls are not just decorations, they're also edible, right? Which is kind of like this inversion and this playfulness that happens on Day of the Dead. So you're not scared of those skulls, you actually eat the skulls. And you usually eat the skulls that have your name written on it. If you were to go to a market, you can get your name put on it. So it's almost as if you're eating your own skull, which is kind of like this weird, funny, festive approach to the holiday, as a way of showing that you're not scared of death necessarily. So you eat your own skull. So it's got a lot of playfulness to it.
Wow, I did not know that. Have you ever eaten one?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They're very sweet. They're very, very sweet. And this is part of the fun of Dia de Muertos, is that there's so much food and so much sweet food available. I swear to God, I gained like 10 pounds from the end of October to beginning of November just from so much eating.
There's also the Catrinas and the Catrins, which come from the satirical sketches of Jose Guadalupe Posada. They are kind of what most people would associate with the face paints that spring up during Day of the Dead. and the sort of skulls that people will decorate themselves with, which dates back to like the 30s, I think.
Yeah, Jose Guadalupe Posada was an artist at the beginning, like early 20th century, created those skulls that are now quite recognizable pretty much everywhere in the globe. The Catrina specifically, it's an image that you'll see pretty much anywhere you go during Day of the Dead in Mexico, US, or Latin America. What's interesting about the face paint, though, this idea of turning your face into a skull or skeleton as part of Día de los Muertos celebrations, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. That's actually born out of the mixture of Day of the Dead and Halloween. So that didn't start being a thing that was done in Mexico until the 1970s and 1980s, in part because of the inspiration from Halloween as immigrants are coming into the United States, becoming associated with Halloween, and then coming back to Mexico. They're also bringing cultural practices back to Mexico, including Halloween. So you see much more dress up and like masquerading as part of Dia de Muertos now, but that's relatively recent. So it's a tradition, but I would say it's not a very long-standing tradition.
Say you're a visitor, you're coming to experience Day of the Dead in one of its traditional places. Is that culturally insensitive to paint your face? Or is it like, do it because we love people to get involved?
I think talk to people here on the ground, see how they feel, get their insight from locals who are really rooted in the traditions and the culture. That would be my advice for this.
I would say that, and this is coming from a US context, when I've talked to the people who organize Dia de los Muertos celebrations in the United States, like who put on these events and fiestas, they really encourage everybody, regardless of where you're coming from, race, religion, ethnicity, etc. They want you to participate in a way that it would seem strange if you don't participate, because then it becomes as if you're some weird tourist who's just looking at the thing as opposed to being a part of the festivity. And most of the organizers want people to be a part of it as much as they can, whether that means dressing up or even creating an altar at the event or something like that, like truly participating. But of course, there's always going to be people who are like, don't appropriate my culture. If you're not Mexican or Mexican American or Latino, then you shouldn't be painting your face. Most Mexicans who I know who organize these events say the exact opposite. They're very encouraging of people to participate as much as possible.
And now the AAA Travel Minute. If you plan on traveling internationally, including taking a cruise out of the US, then you'll need a valid US passport. Most countries require that you present a passport that's valid for at least 6 months after the planned travel dates. If you're in a time crunch, talk to your AAA travel advisor about options for expediting the renewal process. In addition to a valid passport, many popular destinations in Asia, Africa, and South America require a tourist visa as well. So talk to your AAA travel advisor about expediting visas too. A current photo is required to apply for a passport or tourist visa. AAA members can save on government-approved passport photos at a local AAA branch. This has been a AAA Travel Minute. Lauren, tell us a little bit about some of the best places to experience Day of the Dead in Mexico specifically.
I think a classic is Michoacan. I think a lot of people may have heard of Michoacan, specifically like Isla Janitzio, which is this little island in the center of a lake. And that is a very traditional place, I personally think, to celebrate Day of the Dead. I've been there myself, and it's incredible. Then you've also got Mexico City. There is this element of a bit more Halloween coming in Mexico City, a bit more influence from pop culture, for example. So the Mexico City parade that currently happens every year for Day of the Dead was actually inspired by the James Bond film, not the other way around. So that didn't happen in its iteration as we see it now every single year until Spectre was released in, I think, like 2017. So that's really, really interesting to see the influence of this pop culture representation of Day of the Dead coming into the actual Day of the Dead festivities. So you are going to see maybe some less traditional elements here in Mexico City specifically, but you're also going to have the really traditional ofrendas, altares, again, in the Zócalo, in the central square outside the cathedral, and also within government buildings, public buildings, shops even. Aside from that, there's also Hidalgo and San Luis Potosí, which is a little bit north of Mexico City, and you can celebrate, I think, Chantolo. I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. there, which is just kind of like a twist, slight differentiation on your typical Day of the Dead celebrations. And then, of course, Oaxaca, I feel, is a very popular destination generally in Mexico. And you'll see a lot of traditional celebrations and festivities there as well, given the quite high indigenous population, obviously, of those regions, and generally just the south and center of Mexico. Up north in Mexico, specifically, less so, but then as you cross the border, I feel like it really ramps up again. And I can't speak to the US, so maybe I'll let Matteo speak to the US.
I would say in the US, the celebrations that take place in Los Angeles are some of the most incredible celebrations that you'll find, precisely because Los Angeles has the ability, they have multiple events, obviously, because it's a huge city, right? And they have things that we would recognize as deeply traditional events, like a deeply traditional and very sacred and ritual-oriented Día de los Muertos celebration, which is organized by people who actually come from the state of Michoacan, who try and keep that ritual component to the Day of the Dead celebration. And then you have things like the Hollywood Forever Cemetery celebration, which is smack dab in the middle of Hollywood, and it looks like a Hollywood premiere event. So it's like a spectacular event. So Los Angeles has like a wide variety. And of course, because it's such a Latino heavy population in Los Angeles, it's a huge event. Here in Arizona, the Phoenix celebration and the Tucson celebration are quite special. And then San Antonio. San Antonio has got multiple events, and they're all huge events. I'm talking like hundreds of thousands of people come out to the city streets of San Antonio and downtown San Antonio along the river to celebrate. So there's like an aquatic element to the San Antonio celebrations, which is quite special.
It really sounds to me, as someone who's never celebrated Day of the Dead in person anywhere, that each place that has one kind of has its own vibe and its own way of doing it. Like there's all the different traditions that they pull from, but there's not one way to do Day of the Dead. What's like the one thing you have to make it Day of the Dead?
I would broadly agree with that statement. You know, you've got your core elements of Day of the Dead that will probably be replicated everywhere, but there are differences place to place, especially just between Mexico and the US, and then also beyond Mexico, so places like Central America, Bolivia, even like South America, they will celebrate Day of the Dead under different names and in different ways. The core element, in my opinion, would be the altares and the ofrendas, because it's all about the dead, essentially. You know, it's ancestors coming back into the plane of the living for one night. And so that connection with those people is the core element for me. I wonder if you have a different opinion on that, Matteo.
Lauren, I would totally agree with you. First, I want to just pause and say, Angie, if you've never celebrated Día de Muertos, then this is your year. 2024 is the year for you to see something and go somewhere to celebrate this.
Sign me up, but now I have to choose from all these amazing celebrations you guys are talking about, and that's the hardest part.
The ofrenda and the altar, that has to be there. I would say if you go to a fiesta, a Day of the Dead fiesta that doesn't have ofrendas or altars, you're at a party that's a Day of the Dead themed party, but it's not Día de Muertos. And I would say that that would be a big difference. So because it's about honoring the dead and honoring ancestors, if there's no altar, there's no real sacred anchoring in the holiday. You need the altar to anchor that celebration. Otherwise, it really is just kind of a gathering for people to have fun and pretend that what they're doing is celebrating Day of the Dead.
That's a very good point. So let's talk about the food a little bit, because you mentioned the special bread of the dead. So I need to hear about that because I hear it's delicious.
It is delicious. And there are more types than you would imagine as well. My personal favorite is very basic, and it's the classic that most people will have come across or perhaps are most familiar with. What's the best way to describe it? It's a sweet bread covered in sugar and with an orange flavor in. And then it has these kind of decorations on top that are supposed to represent bones. So it kind of looks like a little knobbly tea cake, I would say, from Yorkshire, but bread roll, I guess, is the best way of describing it. But beyond that, there's different types of Day of the Dead bread as well, depending where you are. So like Oaxaca will have pan de yema, is like a year-round bread in Oaxaca, but they'll have kind of Day of the Dead twists on it where you might get faces added onto it or decorations and anything that kind of sets it apart. And then there's sometimes even breads that look like dolls and have different food coloring and designs on them. You can have anise flavored ones with sesame seeds on them. There is a huge variation and they are delicious. And they often crop up on ofrendas, but also just generally around the city at this time of year, you'll be able to find them, eat them. with chocolate on top, with cream in the middle, with ice cream, all sorts of variations. It's fun to try the new inventions every year.
At the end of October, you are going to see bakeries going absolutely nuts to try and get as much pan de muerto out as possible. And you will find many people who try to keep to the, I would say, quote unquote, traditional style. Like they're not trying to do too much with it. They do the bones on the top. It'll have a little bit of orange flavoring and scent to it. And they're just trying to make it as good and buttery and fluffy as humanly possible to make it as appealing. And then you'll have bakeries who try and get crazy with it, right? To try and add new things so that they're trying to innovate this ancient bread in a whole new way. But for me, I really like the old school, just basic pan de muerto, and I'm looking for something that's not too crazy because they're already quite sweet. I'm not trying to put chocolate on there too. I really prefer just the age-old traditional pan de muerto. And I could eat loaves of it. I think most people will get loaves of it too. It's not like you buy one, you're going to buy several.
So here's a question for the uninitiated. How legit is Coco, the movie, for preparing you for what a Day of the Dead celebration might be like?
I've got two perspectives, and they may be contradictory, but this is how I think about it. On one hand, what Disney did was absolutely fantastic because they provided an entry point for people who are totally unfamiliar with the holiday. They provided them an entry point with which to kind of vaguely understand the gist of it, right? I wouldn't say that it's 100% accurate by any means, and there's a lot of things that Disney is inventing because, of course, it has to tell a story that's going to sell and make $1 billion, which it has, right? So there's that element to it. And even though I'm Chicano, even though I'm Mexican-American and am going to pass this tradition on to my daughter and to my nieces and nephews and all that stuff, I totally took them to go see Coco in the theater. There's something funny about like the fact that it's Disney, it's a Disney cultural representation that makes it cool in a way that if it was just Papa or Uncle Matty telling them, to like help make the altar, that's not cool. But now that Coco exists, it's somewhat cool to like be a part of this cultural tradition. So I actually love it for that. The only downside, I would say, is that now Day of the Dead has become the reference point for so many celebrations. In the same way that Lauren was talking about the James Bond movie becomes the reference point for what Day of the Dead is and looks like, Coco is now the reference point so that people show up expecting to see a Day of the Dead celebration that looks like Coco or feels like Coco. And if it does look like Coco, then it's like, oh, I finally found the real thing. This is exactly how it looked like in Coco, which is strange that cinema becomes the reference point for reality as opposed to the other way around. So that's the only downside of it. But now it's totally integrated into celebrations of Day of the Dead in Mexico too. So even in a quote unquote traditional celebration, like down in Oaxaca City, they'll have public screenings of Coco as part of the Day of the Dead celebration. They'll like do community screenings of it. So like Coco is a part of the fabric of Dia de Muertos now. And probably in 50 years, we'll look back and be like, oh, I always thought Coco was a part of it because that's just the power of Disney.
It's certainly cracked it wide open for me and understanding that beautiful sacred tradition of honoring your family. That's so beautiful. The sacred nature of honoring the family. That really is a gift. Dr. Mathew Sandoval and Lauren Cocking, thank you for joining us. And thank you to our listeners for being with us. If you're planning a trip, be sure to connect with a AAA travel advisor. Check out AAA.com/travel or visit your local branch. This podcast is a production of Auto Club Enterprises. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave us a review. I'm Angie Orth. Thank you for traveling with AAA.